From the language app Babbel, this is Multilinguish. I'm senior producer Steph Koifman. I don't think I'm going to shock anyone if I say that America is running a deficit when it comes to foreign language education. And by deficit, I mean that it's behind much of the rest of the world. The vast majority of America's bilingualism is thanks to people who grew up speaking other languages at home, not thanks to our schools. Something like 20 to 26% of American adults consider themselves bilingual, depending on how you frame the question. But less than 1% are actually proficient in a language they studied in a US classroom, even though 93% of US high schools were offering foreign language courses as of 2008. If you were looking for a comparison point, 66% of the world's overall population is proficient in more than one language. There are absolutely arguments you can make about why language learning is less of a priority in the States. But there are certain universal truths about language classrooms that become compounded and magnified within a system that's just not getting very good results. What we're about to talk about is in no way limited to what happens in American classrooms. But for better or for worse, the American language classroom is what shaped me and my co-hosts for this episode. And we can personally speak from experience about the myths of early education that we later had to unlearn and unpack as adults. Your language teacher probably meant well. They also probably lied to you a little. In this episode, I'll be joined by social media producer Nasir Fleming and content producer David Duchin for a rousing expose on the biggest myths about language learning. Then we'll reconvene to talk about the biggest lies our language learning teachers personally told us. Before we get started, a reminder to rate and review Multilinguish wherever you listen, and be sure you're subscribed so you get new episodes as soon as they're released. So I'm here with Nasir and David. How are you guys today?
Doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm good. Are you ready to blow up some language learning myths with me?
Yeah, we're language mythbusters.
That's
On
our
the case.
official title.
Yeah. So who has one they want to start with? I mean, I do if no one else does.
Yeah, I think you lead us off and we will chime in if anything kind of resonates with us.
Okay. So I think the first and the most prevalent one is the critical period hypothesis. So most people don't know it by its formal bow tie name. Most people know it as, your only chance to really learn a bunch of languages is when you're a kid. And if you waited too long, then too bad. You're never going to be fluent in another language because all kids have this like magic sponge brain. And adults just can't learn languages as well as children can. And this idea actually came from psycholinguist Eric Lenneberg, and it's based in this in some brain science because there's something that happens after puberty where the lateralization of your brain function finishes, and that's when your language skills become fully localized in the left hemisphere. But a lot of modern researchers have pointed out that there's a lack of evidence, and a lot of recent studies have actually shown that adults might actually outperform children in terms of how quickly they can pick up new languages. So, I mean, think about it, right? Like, how long does it take for a child to even be able to form like a complete sentence? They spend a couple years just kind of like saying goo goo gaga and like just having like these very simple sentences. And when you're a grown up, like you already have this built in understanding of grammar and how it works. And that is something that you can actually easily transfer to grammatically correct speech in other languages.
Right. I feel like this is a topic that comes up in linguistics all the time.
Yeah.
And I studied linguistics, so I don't want to make this more technical than it needs to be. But we know that in most cases, children who have a normal development, most of the kids in the world grow up without ever getting like a formal training in language, and they're able to speak what we would consider flawlessly or grammatically. And it's not like they're running through lists of rules in their heads like we would learn in a Spanish classroom, for example, or from a textbook. So it sounds good to say, oh yeah, of course, there's this window of time where you are optimized for language learning and your brain is like a sponge. I love thinking of it like that because it makes sense when we look at where children start, which is kind of this blank slate, some people would say, and then where they end up, which is being able to fully use language. But then I think you've brought up some good point stuff that there's a lot of nuance too. Like adults in some cases actually are really really well equipped and better wired for doing a lot of things we know, and one of them could be language learning, and I'm sure it depends on the adult too. It's not just a blanket, oh, all kids are better at picking up language because their brains work that way, and then when you grow into adulthood and become older, your brain automatically stops functioning in the way that makes you good at learning languages. I think there's so much more complexity and nuance to this question. All this to say, I think it's just too complex to say yes, kids are better at learning languages than adults are. And this that kind of in me brings up what I was going to mention for one of the myths that I've heard a lot, um, in my language learning studies, which is that, um, and stop me if you don't want me to talk about this now, but it's about immersion in the way that a lot of language teachers and language programs will say the best way to learn a language is like a child. It's like that to me seems a little bit silly based on
Mhm.
the experiences I've had learning languages. It's like, okay, well, I am an adult. I have access to my native language fully, which is English. So why can't I use that as a tool to help me learn a new language like Spanish or French? If
Yeah.
something My brain works in a way where I've been wired to see patterns in things and to draw logical conclusions from A to B. So why should I have to shut down all of the other ways my brain works and the tools that it has given me to understand the world, to learn a language? Why can't I use my L1, my native language, English, to understand or talk through difficult concepts in Spanish, or to ask questions, instead of me just being thrown out into a world of immersion where I have no tools at my disposal other than a few words I've picked up in Spanish here or there.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that kind of relates to childhood language learning, and that obviously it looks different from adult language learning, but to be an adult and learn a new language, I don't think you necessarily have to go back to being like a child. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and totally. Now it's like I'm kind of having these images in my mind of kind of like deciding that I want to learn Turkish and just starting out with a bunch of babbling.
No pun intended.
Oh, I didn't
No
even mean to
branding
do that.
intended. Yeah.
I didn't mean that.
Yeah, going off of what David was saying, it's absolutely complex. But oftentimes I feel like having a grasp on a certain language can help you to improve your fluency in another language. So, um, for example, right now I live in Mexico, and although I've been studying Spanish since I was 13, knowing what I know in the English language now after university has helped me to elevate my skills in Spanish, whether it's using bigger words in Spanish or whether it's breaking down certain tenses.
Hmm.
So, as a kid, as a child, maybe it is easier to pick up on things and to remember them, but usually we don't understand how language works and functions until we're older. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with being an adult and studying a language, and sometimes it could be super beneficial.
Yeah, totally. I think it's like maybe like that's really where the difference is that if you're a child, it just kind of happens without your input. You just learn the language. But I mean, I guess technically, if you're an adult learning a language, it's going to be work, but it doesn't mean that like you wasted a critical window. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, there's also, I mean, there's also the factor of like, you're learning because you want to as an adult, and that actually makes a big difference. Um, there was a study in the 60s that found that motivation actually had a measurable effect on long-term memory recall. So literally, if you're more motivated to be learning the language, like you're gonna remember it better.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. It's like learning any new skill. If you want to learn how to be really good at chess, some people would say, "Oh, I'm just not wired for it. My brain doesn't work that way. I might as well not try." And sure, there are some people who are naturally talented at chess, or they're naturally talented at learning languages. But if you really want to get better at something like chess or learning languages, and you put in the hours and you see your work pay off, and you build confidence, and you have practice talking with native speakers, or playing chess games, for example, you're going to get better and you're going to learn and adapt to your own styles of learning, and you'll figure out better how you process new information and work with that. So it seems to me to be a very individualized process. It doesn't seem like you could say, oh, well, you're an adult and you don't seem naturally built or wired for language learning, therefore you missed your window, you might as well not try.
Yeah. And now that you mentioned that, that actually dovetails pretty neatly into my other myth that I was going to bring up, which is that you're either fluent or you're not. That, like, also that perfect fluency should be your goal because, I mean, what does that even mean, first of all? And this kind of obsession with perfection is something that ends up hurting the learning process for a lot of people because I guess it really depends on how you feel about making mistakes. Some people believe that, like, you know, mistakes are part of the learning process. Other people believe that, like, if you make a lot of mistakes, you're just not talented and you shouldn't really try. And that ends up kind of like shutting down the learning process. That can happen. Um, so yeah, so there's this whole idea that, like, if you're learning a language you should be doing it to be perfectly fluent, and then that kind of calls into question, like, you know, how many native speakers are even perfectly fluent, because if you look at like the full range of vocabulary in a given language, most people don't have that vocabulary set. um, and most people who are native speakers can make grammatical mistakes too. So again, it's like, does it really matter as long as communication is happening if you're not perfect? And, you know, even if you're not perfect, your brain is still getting all of the benefits of learning a new language. So,
Right. And if we think
yeah.
about intent too, not everyone learns a language to be able to go and move to a place that speaks the language and live there for the rest of their lives. If you did, which some people do, you're probably going to want to be as fluent as possible. You're going to want to know a whole bunch of vocab about a bunch of different topics and themes. You want to know how to form complex grammatical constructions and all of that sort of stuff. But if you're just learning Spanish to take a month long vacation to South America, you don't need to be fluent. You obviously need to be able to get around, ask for directions, order at a restaurant, buy a hotel room or something like that. But we know that language learning is a process that takes a long, long time. And so if you need it for a specific purpose, or maybe you just want to get to know your Spanish speaking neighbor a little bit better, you don't need to be go 0 to 100 full fluency to do things like that. You just need to adapt the learning process to your own needs, shorten it, of course. Don't spend time. If you don't care about sports or business or medicine, then don't learn vocabulary for sports or business or medicine, stuff like that.
Mhm.
And kind of fine tune your learning process to what you need it to be. Don't learn how to form the past perfect subjunctive in Spanish if you don't anticipate you're going to need to talk about things that happen in the past perfect subjunctive mood. And that might obviously be something you never come across if you're just doing a rudimentary or very basic kind of Spanish intro to get you ready for a trip. So it's something you wouldn't even have to worry about avoiding. But my point is, fluency is a great goal to try to achieve, but it takes so long, and it's not necessary for everyone, of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Also, going off of that, as long as we can effectively communicate with someone, I would say that we could potentially consider ourselves to be fluent. And oftentimes in the language space, I just feel like there's such um, like a pretentious cloud when it comes to
Mhm.
fluency.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I've noticed that a lot, not so much in middle school and high school, but when I got to college, like you have your hardcore language majors who are doing the absolute most, and good for them. That's really exciting for them. But at the same time, it's really important to realize that what do we consider to be fluent? Because, for example, if someone speaks fluently in Mexican slang, does that mean that they're not fluent in Spanish? And
Mm.
it just depends on the context, I would say, for the most part. And yeah, for all of the language learners out there, as long as you can order your coffee and as long as you can do what you intend to do, you're doing great.
That's very true. I mean, how many conversations, um I mean, I feel like it's happened both ways, right? Like, I've had conversations with someone else who is using their broken English, or like I was using my broken Spanish or Russian. And they still understood what I was trying to say. Um, so it kind of worked out.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, David. And
No, I was just nodding along verbally, offering
yeah.
Mhm.
some affirmation, but I'm sorry. Go ahead, Nasir.
Yeah, yeah, no worries. And in university, I studied French, and when I went to go study abroad in France, I realized that the idea of fluency is often just it's just like post-colonial talking,
It's a
essentially.
construct. It's all a
Yeah,
construct.
Yeah.
essentially. And I just think that oftentimes we, of course, place importance on X, Y, and Z in certain languages so that we can keep certain people out of certain spaces and
Uh-huh. Yeah,
move. Yeah, like it's 2021. Let's keep it moving. Let's evolve.
totally. How about, so raise your hand if you've ever been personally victimized by the learning styles myth.
My hand is raised.
Yeah.
My hand is half raised. Can you just explain what that is?
Sure. So the learning styles myth is the one where it's like you're either a visual, auditory, or tactical learner. And there's like everyone kind of fits into one category, and you should kind of tailor everything that you do to kind of suit your learning style.
Okay. Yeah, going off of that, in most of my life, I've always been a kinetic learner. So when it comes to
Mhm.
language, like what am I gonna do? Go rub a rock and be like, oh, piedra in Spanish? Like, okay.
Have you actually tried that though? Maybe it would work.
That is very, very true.
Yeah.
And but I will say, going off of that, in terms of, I guess I don't know if this would make me more of a visual learner, but I'm a lot stronger in Spanish and French when I'm actually reading a text compared to when I'm listening to someone speaking it. So I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for language learning specifically, this learning styles myth really can't hold a lot of water. Maybe for other disciplines or fields of study, sure. But language learning is about so many different elements of learning. It's visuals, you have reading, it's and writing, of course. It's auditory, you have listening and speaking, which is productive. And then so when we talk about language learning within the confines of Babbel's content strategy, we approach it from four different angles, which I think a lot of people would agree with, language teachers and linguists: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And you have to
Mhm.
master all of those to be able to really be fluent in a language. So, sure, some people are more visual learners than others, or some people do better with audio learning, and that's great. But I don't think that that necessarily has to apply to the way you learn languages. In fact, it could be a detriment to say you're an audio focused learner, so you should only really learn Spanish or French with audio materials, because then you miss out on a
Yeah.
whole swath of what it's like to engage with the text visually, or even watch a movie with subtitles. That's a really helpful thing for me
Mhm.
to be able to do, because I can combine two different forms of learning at once: listening to the dialogue, but also watching something engaging and being able to read the text on the screen. So
Mhm.
maybe this is just me kind of being more fluid. I don't know that I am partial to one learning style over another. And some people might say, "Oh, I'm so visual, and I know that about myself, and therefore I'm going to tailor my language learning process to be mostly visual," and that could actually work for them. But
Mhm.
personally, I'm like, no, I got to get a mix of everything, because I want to have a well-rounded approach to language learning. I want to be able to engage with the text I'm reading, but also listen to a podcast or a song and understand what they're saying too, and then be able to have a conversation with a native speaker by producing language out loud, and then be able to write, a text to my friend in Spanish and practice that way too. So I'm I'm very much in the camp that a mix of learning styles is the best way to go.
Yeah, well, you're actually onto something because studies have shown that most people are kind of a mixed bag, and that it's not so much about like, I am visual, therefore everything I learn must be visual. It's that it's actually best to tailor the learning style to the material. So like it really depends on what you're doing. It doesn't depend on you so much as like what you're trying to study. And it's more about like figuring out the best way to present information to yourself and changing up your methods, like you said, to see what clicks depending on what it's for. Just kind of funny. There was actually a few years ago, there were like dozens of psychologists who signed like a letter in the Guardian, pleading teachers to stop trying to teach learning styles in the classroom. There was like an open letter.
Really, that
Yeah.
seems kind of funny to me. I feel like teachers want to encourage students to learn the way that works best for them,
Yeah.
but at the same time, I can see how if you don't explore a lot of different options for learning for yourself, if you're just stuck in one sort of framework and you say, "Oh, I'm a visual learner, so I'm only going to focus on visual learning," that might restrict you as well.
Yeah. Totally. Um, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say that learning style is usually like personality types. No one's 100% one personality type or 0%. Usually it's a nice mix of all. So I agree with you and David.
Yeah, we're all vast. We all contain multitudes.
Hmm.
In that
Yeah.
moment, we were infinite.
Oh my gosh.
Well, on that note, I think let's take a quick break. And then when we get back, we're going to talk about some of the personal lies that we've had to undo or unlearn.
Let's do it.
Yay.
Okay.
Hey, it's Dylan. Multilinguish is brought to you by Babbel, the language app. Our marketing team wants you to know that Babbel teaches you 14 languages, including Spanish, French, Italian, Russian, and more. And the app's created by real language teachers. You'll learn how to have conversations in real-life situations, like getting to know your neighbors, or maybe telling them to put on their mask and stay 6 feet away from you. Either way, we're offering Multilinguish listeners 50% off a 3-month subscription. New customers can get this offer by visiting babbel.com/podcast. That's BABBEL.com/podcast. Now, back to the show.
Okay, and we are back. So do you guys have one myth, one personal story or myth that you'd like to lead with?
Sure. So yeah, I've been taking language classes since I was maybe 12 or 13, since middle school, and I was one of those language nerds who was studying both Spanish and French. So I had a lot of different teaching styles that I've interacted with, and also lots of myths. And one of them, specifically in Spanish, because I'm from Connecticut, and the town I'm in Connecticut is has a huge Spanish-speaking population.
Mhm.
So oftentimes in our courses, we would have first generation students, and they would use certain terms from their countries, and our professor or teacher would usually say, "Oh, people don't say that." And as a child, I didn't realize, but that is so horribly offensive
I know.
to. Yeah, it's terrible.
It's like, how would you know, first of all?
Yeah. And for the most part, at least in my town in Connecticut, a lot of the Spanish teachers weren't actual native speakers. They were like, let me just go study abroad and start my life, which is great. Do you? But oftentimes in these courses, I learned that for these teachers, at least, there was only one way of speaking Spanish, and they truly enforced that. And it wasn't until I got into university and started to travel a bit more where I realized that no, even the English language, if we look at Connecticut compared to Vermont, compared to Nebraska, we all speak
Mm,
differently. So for my language learners out there, there's not only one type of way to speak a language, there are millions.
totally. I have one. So this kind of goes into what you were saying before, David, about how like you should try to learn like a baby, and it reminds me a lot of my language learning experiences growing up because my teachers tended to have this rule where you, as soon as you entered the classroom, like you weren't allowed to speak English, and I understand and appreciate why they did that, but I think that after I left a classroom setting and kind of was more on my own, I found that sometimes it is useful to use English to understand a language better or to translate things into English or vice versa. Of course, you shouldn't rely on that too much because the way that sentences or phrases are constructed are not going to follow the same syntax. So you can end up sounding with something that like came straight out of Google Translate if you do that too much. But I mean, when I was studying abroad in Spain and I had an internship at a magazine, and like one of my tasks was to see if there was anything from um, the English editions that might be like good for translating into the Spanish edition. And one way that I did that was literally just kind of doing my best to sort of translate it into like a rough Spanish version. And then like my boss would read it over and he'd kind of get the gist of it based on that. Of course, it wasn't like a perfect clean copy, but it was enough to sort of get the job done. And when I was like writing papers for my classes, um, I ended up like, kind of formulating my thoughts in English and kind of doing my best to sort of um, translate them. And for the most part, like as long as I sort of like kept some of the basic grammar structures in mind, I found that it kind of worked better for me to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, those are all great points. And I think that feeds into what I was going to say, which kind of sums up a lot of what we've been talking about. But the myth that I've heard over and over that if you don't communicate what you want to say in your target language exactly perfectly according to all the grammatical rules that we've learned from the teachers or the textbooks, that you won't be understood, or that the person you're speaking to will give you a puzzled look, or they'll start laughing because they can tell that you're not a native speaker and that you've made a fool of yourself. And maybe it's this rhetoric is a little extreme and I didn't hear it
Yeah.
like this exactly from every teacher I've had, but the idea that when I'm learning Spanish, which I've learned for years now, that if you get the wrong verb conjugation, or you put the wrong verb conjugation on a verb, or you substitute one vocab word for another that's actually the better choice, or you forget to add the subject where the subject is necessary, for example, that a Spanish speaker will be completely lost, that they'll never be able to understand you. And that scared me for a bit. I was thinking, okay, well, I have to get it perfect every time I speak or every time I write something, or else
Mhm.
I'm not going to be understood. And in my experience traveling through Spanish speaking countries or talking with native speakers, I know that that's not the case. I've, of course, had some issues and some trouble communicating when I can't think of the right word to say, or when I forget a grammar construction that I learned before, but I've, for the most part, been able to get my point across and have a productive conversation with somebody without too much trouble. And instead of me feeling anxious or panicky about not knowing the right word or how to form the right verb conjugation, for example, I just accept that it's okay to make the mistake, and instead of stopping the conversation altogether because I'm afraid that I won't be able to communicate, I just go for some alternative that works. And in some cases, stuff that means using an English word or trying to explain around something in English, my native language, hoping to find some common ground with a Spanish speaker who might know a little English, for example. But I also think of people who are learning English who haven't reached full fluency yet. And
Mhm.
when they make mistakes in English and they're speaking to me, I don't stop the conversation and say, wait, I can't understand you. What are you talking about? I use
Mhm.
context clues to kind of piece it together. And if someone says, he goed to the supermarket, then I know, okay, that person meant to say he went to the supermarket, but obviously went is a weird, irregular past form of go. So how would that person be expected to know that? I know what that person was trying to say. So
Right.
I'm meeting that person in the middle and we're having a productive conversation anyways. It doesn't have to be perfect on their end, just like it doesn't have to be perfect on my end when I'm speaking Spanish or French or Dutch or whatever I'm learning. So I want to dispel the myth that you have to speak perfectly, that you have to get it right 100% of the time, because you really don't. And speakers, I think, are really impressed when you even know how to speak a little bit of their language, or maybe a little bit more. They're happy that you're engaging with them and willing to try in the first place.
Absolutely. I've also learned that honestly, before 8 a.m., before that first cup of coffee, even native speakers are making mistakes in their native language. So
Yeah.
don't, yeah, don't worry about it.
Yeah, no, it kind of reminds me, I forget where I read this, but someone was talking about how they went out to dinner with their friend, and it was like in a language that they were kind of just starting to learn, and all they understood the word for tea when the friend was speaking to the waiter, and they were like, "Oh, just so you know, like, I don't really want any tea." And she was like, "Oh my god, you understood what I was saying?" And they were like, "No, I just understood one word, but like based on the context clues, I kind of figured it out."
Yep, that's how it works so often when you're kind of just figuring it out along the way, which is most of the language learning process before you reach full fluency. It's just like kind of piecemeal and picking up one word that you hear from this sentence and another that you hear from this sentence and constructing a message with
Yeah.
limited data. But that's okay.
Absolutely.
That's part of how you learn. So it's all good.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And even going off of that, I just think back to my study abroad days when I wasn't like the best in French, but when someone in French would ask me if I wanted another shot, I didn't know the do you want another part? I just knew shot. And I was like, oh no, no more shots for me. So it is all about piecing together.
Yeah. Language for real life.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, how about this one? There's this whole kind of I think most of us grow up with this notion that the best way to learn a language is just to sit there and memorize conjugation tables over and over again, and also like the more you study per day, the better your results are going to be. So like that's how you learn a language, right? Like you just open the textbook and you go over the conjugation tables and you cram it all into your head, and that's how you become proficient.
Yeah, that doesn't sit right with me. But that's not just about language learning. That's with anything. I feel like a lot of people in their experience as students would tell you that cramming is not the most effective way. I mean,
Totally.
it certainly can make you feel like you're doing the most at when you have, an hour to study, or let's say a night to study before a big test, and you spend every waking hour of your life before that test cramming, and you're like, okay, I've done the absolute maximum that I can do. But then you're also affecting how tired you are and how well your brain retains information because you try to overload it so much. So language learning, I think, is a great example of how you got to kind of take it piece by piece and take it slow and make sure that you really fundamentally understand one concept before you move on to the next, or else it's just all going to go in one ear or in out the other, or in your eyes and back out your eyes. I don't know what the equivalent of in one eye and out the other, but you know what I'm talking about. And it seems really, really self evident that, to me at least, in my experience, that cramming from a textbook, just flipping through pages and pages and spending hours on trying to learn a bunch of vocab isn't going to be what helps it stick with you. It's repeated exposure and
Hmm.
repeated practice.
Totally. Yeah. That's kind of like, I think that was sort of, not to be too salesy, but like that was kind of the thing that stood out to me the most, like, when I started working for Babbel and like getting to know the sort of thinking behind the way that the lessons are structured. That basically like, you can spend 15 to 20 minutes a day studying a language, and that's actually going to lead to good results because it's like respecting the fact that your brain can't absorb too much material at a single time, and that like it's actually better to take a small chunk of things. It's called there's a principle in psychology called chunking, where like your brain can only absorb around 7 new things at a time. So if you try to just limit it to like 7 new things, and you just keep repeating those things at like a spaced interval, then that's how you move it from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. And it's kind of nice to think that like you don't have to bludgeon your brain to learn a new language. And that sometimes like obviously it's important to know how to conjugate verbs and all of that, but um it's certainly not like the only thing that matters, and it's certainly not the only approach that's gonna work.
That's very, very true. And even when speaking, oftentimes just, even if we forget a word or something, just depending on your tone or what hand expressions you use, that can oftentimes get the point across. So, yeah, I definitely wouldn't stress out over knowing every single word in the language because that's unfortunately impossible.
Okay, Steph.
Well,
I have one more that might be kind of controversial. One more little
Oh,
myth.
I love controversy. Okay.
So this is a hot take. Get ready. But Google Translate can be your friend. I know
That's
everyone
true.
gasp.
That's true.
Well, a
Yeah.
language teacher would slap me in the face for saying that, but
Mhm.
it's kind of like the whole don't use Wikipedia as a source.
Mhm.
And when you're writing a history paper, for example, which is valid, but I think you have to unpack that and say, why is this a myth? Why could there be some truth to the idea that you should use Google Translate as your friend? And I'll make it really quick, but I, of course, don't think you should use Google Translate when you're just, learning the fundamentals of a language, when you're writing a Spanish essay or doing your Spanish homework, and you're supposed to actually learn how to form sentences and use grammar. Google Translate's not going to teach you those lessons. It might give you what you're looking for if you plug in one sentence and happen to get, the best translation out of it. But that's also a gamble, and you're not going to learn much that way. But I do use Google Translate when I think that I've mastered or tried to really understand a concept and I want to kind of put it into use. One example that comes to mind is, case marking in German. So German has four cases: the nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive. And that is kind of, for people who don't know what case marking is, it sounds kind of scary, and it is kind of scary, but the way that I see it in action is by putting sentences into Google Translate and seeing what article, so the word, in this case the word the, that comes before a noun, which article or form of the article is used when the noun is in certain positions in the sentence, which is kind of what case marking is all about. So like if I were to say the man eats, der Mann isst, and this is me citing some earlier writing that I did for Babbel. So I don't know German super well, but I remember using Google Translate for this exact example. So I type in Google Translate in English, the man eats, and it spits out der Mann isst in German. But if I say something like the lion eats the man, well, then the man is in the object position of the sentence and it becomes den Mann. So it went from der Mann to den Mann. And that
Oh,
helps me see like a visual contrast. Okay, the man in the sentence is either the subject in the first sentence or the object in the second sentence, and I can visually map out like how it in a sentence that I came up with. So I was able to kind of be creative about it. I can see the two ways that these articles look different. And maybe a different web page or a textbook could have shown me that too, but it allowed me to kind of play around in real time, typing stuff into Google Translate, being like, okay, how does it change? How does this one word in its article change when I move it around in the sentence? And I get to be the one moving it around instead of just kind of
mhm.
like reading something that's been written for me. So all this to say, Google Translate can be a really helpful tool, as can other translation tools on the internet. And don't be afraid of using them if you have ways to kind of get creative and innovative that aren't substituting for actual instruction and for actual understanding, if that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah. I find that like generally like the more simple the phrase or like Google Translate can work if you're just looking up a word. Of course, it's not going to give you like every single iteration of a word all the time, but like generally like the more simple the word of the word of the phrase is, like the more likely you're going to get an accurate translation. I find that like sometimes I'll use like the automatic translate feature if it's just like a web page and I just want to be able to kind of get the gist of what it's saying. But it's obviously not something you should rely on for, um, you know, getting your sentence set up correctly or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. For syntax, probably not. But in terms of like languages that are accent heavy, especially French, yeah, Google Translate was my best friend in college because I'm like, oh my God, am I using my accent aigu or my accent grave? Like
Mhm.
sometimes you just need that visual component, as David said.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me today. It was such a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Steph. This was really fun.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you so much for having us. I can't wait to send this to my middle school and high school Spanish and French teachers.
No shade or anything. All right. Bye.
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 Multilinguish is a production of the language app Babbel. This episode was produced by me, Steph Koifman, with guest appearances by Nasir Fleming and David Dugin. Editing and sound design is by Brian Rosado. You can read about today's episode topic and more on Babbel magazine. Just visit babbel.com/magazine. Say hi on social media by finding us at Babbel USA. Finally, please rate and review this podcast. We really appreciate it.